Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar. It's the first webinar in our Municipal Climate Action Toolkit series, and today we're going to be talking about carbon budgets with our Director of Design and Engagement, Naomi Devine, and Jill Hudgins from the City of Fredericton. So before we get started, I'd like to start by doing a brief land acknowledgement. I'd like to recognize that we are here today because we care deeply about the well-being of our planet. SSG's work, directed at trying to build healthy, resilient, and equitable communities, is carried out on unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous territories, ranging from the traditional lands of the Michif in the north to the Weegie in the south, from the Hulku peoples in the west to the Mi'kmaq in the east. The historical peoples of this land stewarded what we now call the Americas for time immemorial. We acknowledge the historic and continued oppression of these people and believe that our work in leading a transition to a decarbonized future must also contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey that we all share together. I personally am joining from the traditional unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations. So thank you. So before we kind of dive into today's topic, we'd like to get a sense of who's in the room. We're going to be using a tool called Mentimeter. And so you can join us by going to menti.com, open another tab on your browser or on your phone and put in the code 19987456. It's right there at the top of the screen. We just want to get a sense of what roles folks who are here play in their cities and kind of how familiar you are with carbon budgets. So our first question is, how familiar are you with carbon budgets? And I think folks are still logging on. If anybody is having any issues accessing Mentimeter, please do let us know. Oh, great, we're getting some responses. Oh, we have one person who can lead a webinar on carbon budgets. That's awesome. If you have things to add during the discussion or the Q&A, we'd love to hear about your experiences. Oh, sorry, I think I misread that. There's one person who strongly disagrees they could lead a webinar on carbon budgets. My mistake.
I thought we could invite somebody else into the mix with that. They could help. They could join in the delivery of today if they wanted.
Yeah. Welcome to everybody who's just joining. If you just logged on to the call, please join us at menti.com using the code at the top of the screen that's being shared to answer some questions about what you know about carbon budgets. So it seems like there's a few people who don't know what a carbon budget is, and that's fantastic. This webinar is going to be catered to all levels. So we're going to be going over what a carbon budget is and also, information for folks who already know what it is and how they can apply it. We'd also like to know what department you work in to get a sense of where people are joining us from today. One person in finance, that's awesome. A lot of people in sustainability and climate. Planning and development as well. It's really great to see people from other municipal departments besides sustainability and climate because as you'll see, this kind of concept we're presenting today would affect everyone.
We've just got people still rolling in. So every so often, I'm also putting menti.com in the chat, in the code as well. Hopefully that's, if you haven't had a chance to get in yet, that's easier for you to access. It's also at the top of the screen, as Aaliyah has mentioned. Aisha, if I could ask you to just also copy and paste, just also as well as I let people in, that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Naomi. So next, we wanted to know if you are using climate accountability tools in your municipality. So that might include things like a climate emergency declaration, a climate target, a climate action plan, a climate lens framework, a carbon budget framework. You might be discussing the task force for climate disclosure and how it applies to your work. Um, Great, we're seeing quite a lot of different things up there. And a few people that don't work at a municipality, welcome. Awesome. It seems like a good chunk of you have a climate action plan and a climate target, which is great. And also a climate lens framework, which is kind of like a good first step to getting into carbon budgeting. Should we go to the next slide? So today's agenda, we've just gone through the welcome. My colleague Naomi Devine is going to be going over carbon budgeting and explaining a framework for approaching it. We're then going to hear from Jill at the City of Fredericton, who's going to talk about their experience applying a carbon budget. And we're going to save a lot of time at the end for a Q&A to learn about kind of what you folks want to know and try to answer those questions. So Naomi Devine leads design and engagement in climate action planning at SSG. She's passionate about shaping bold, transformative strategies, and she works closely with communities and governments to implement policies that drive systemic change towards a climate-friendly future. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Naomi.
Thanks very much, Aaliyah, and welcome everyone. We're so glad you can join us today. Really nice to see this level of interest and participation in a very important topic in climate action planning. And so I've been a climate action planner also for almost 20 years now and have had the pleasure of working on carbon budgets with some municipalities in Canada. So we see this as still in the leading edge, sort of phase of implementing your climate action plan and making sure that we all have practical ways to contribute to reducing our global greenhouse emissions, but focusing on our own backyards. So it becomes important to think about this through the lens of every ton actually matters. For those of you who have had climate action plans, sort of already put in place or might be working with them underway, you'll understand there's a lot of moving parts to those. You generally have a multi-decade, sort of lens on those things. And the question, I think, of practicality comes up pretty soon in terms of how do you also now make sure that when we implement these actions, collectively, that we're actually moving in the right direction and doing what we have set out to do and hitting the targets, essentially, that councils, across the nation and across the continent really have put into place. So the carbon budget framework is a greenhouse gas emissions management system that essentially scales down the global carbon budget into a municipal carbon budget. So thereby it establishes a ceiling on the amount of emissions that can be released by the community. So this, of course, will affect corporate operations, but of course, ultimately, as this idea spreads and we're all sort of contributing to it, it's reducing community emissions as well. We can go to the next slide. Now, there's multiple ways to sort of approach this, depending on a slower start or a faster start or a steady as she goes, you know what I mean, sort of scenario, as you can see on the screen. So there's different pathways to get to these targets, but the pathways really matter. They result in different outcomes and different levels of global concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions. So while we might have the 2050 target, your community might have the 2050 target. That's great. How we get there, though, now matters. And the bottom line is the quicker, sort of the better. If we go you want to be in sort of closer to the left-hand scenario, fewest emissions, of course, as reasonable, then the most emissions. You can get there, but you'll have made such an over contribution to greenhouse gas emissions that it sort of impacts the concentration, essentially globally. So let's go to the next slide. And so here, what you can see in terms of a sample carbon budget, sort of based on that first scenario in the last slide. And I meant to mention too, we've had the right targets, but we might have the wrong strategy. That's also why you want to sort of get to reducing emissions as quick as possible, as soon as possible. Is that you can sort of see in this in the slope is that we want to reduce them as soon as possible, but we also measure, and you'll have seen in your climate action plan if you have one, of course, the business as usual scenario. So that shows you for every ton that we don't get to reduce, it becomes a carbon liability. So we're accounting for it. We have a form of accountability in this framework that starts to show you what the potential impact will be, and sort of how impacting how quickly, of course, you can get on track to meeting your carbon budget and thereby meeting your target, sort of ultimately. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So in terms of getting sort of a bit more granular essentially with this, if you're starting with your greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and we see a bit of a straight line scenario of a carbon budget, so that's the bottom, and the area under that green triangle in the graph is the entire carbon budget. Essentially that would be the total emissions that can be emitted for the community up until the target year. And the target year tends to be right now 2050. So you do your greenhouse gas emissions inventory, of course, to understand where you're at with respect to emissions and where they're coming from and their sources. And naturally, we would see right now, as this is new, that there will be a deficit, right? So looking at the 2020 greenhouse gas emissions inventory in this scenario, the difference between where you're at with your emissions reductions and where the actual carbon budget is, if you follow that out, of course, to the right, you see what your future carbon liability is. So a bit of a different way of showing what we saw on the last screen. And of course, you've got your long-term carbon forecast. So in many communities, if you don't already have a climate action plan, you probably have some policies and actions in place to reduce emissions. But if they're not sort of in a low carbon sort of trajectory or target, you might be on a trajectory to increase your emissions. So again, this is the mechanism that helps us start to really sort of ratchet down where our emissions are coming from, and understanding how to get or understanding clearly where we need to get in order for you to be successful in meeting your target. I should also say too that if you have any questions as the presentation is going on, please feel free to put them in the chat as well. One of our team members will either answer it right away, or we'll make sure we come to it in the question and answer portion of today's webinar. All right, so as I've sort of alluded to already, we want to think of carbon budgets as a management, sort of system. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so we're not alone, which is nice to see. And this helps us also answer more specific questions around how do we spend the limited, of course, carbon that each community has, and like globally, sort of that we share. And how do we start to look at that from a fair share sort of perspective? So the framework is intended to guide decision making in the city, much the same way that your financial budget does. And so the work is challenging, as I've sort of alluded to as well. And we don't pretend, of course, that it isn't, but also changing the way we do things, will require some time, but it requires also specific tools to help us learn how we can best get there. And we have a great example today in Fredericton about how they're actually working out the details of how all this works. So I'm excited for us to get to that portion of the webinar for you. So we might not be used to thinking about our entirety of our plans in municipalities as like an emissions, sort of based projects, but they of course are, including road networks, waste management, recreation facilities, are all responsible to the contribution of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So as you introduce a framework into your municipality, it really grounds the lesson that both the science of climate change, like how we quantify where the emissions are, and practically how we start to get to the business of reducing them, sort of really comes together. Next slide, please. And so thinking about the sort of global carbon budget, essentially has been set to avoid global warming, to avoid warming the Earth more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. The atmosphere can absorb no more than 400 gigatons, and that was from 2020. That target obviously shifts with where we're at in terms of global emissions sort of each year. So essentially 400 gigatons, the question becomes, what is your sort of fair share? And that if you hit that target where you have that ceiling on your emissions, by the time we hit 2050, you'll have made your fair share contribution to emissions reductions in the overall global plan. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so again, as I mentioned, how are we going to spend this? We definitely need to think of this as a management system, and how essentially we're going to modify or alter our operations inside the municipality to get to the target. Next slide. And again, we're not alone. So a sort of big moment in carbon budgeting, sort of around the world was the UK's carbon budget. So they first introduced their carbon budget in 2008, and their carbon budget is a 5-year statutory cap on global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's how you see they've decided to contribute to the fair share sort of conversation. And the UK has cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% between 1990 and 2022, while growing its economy by 79%. So we have a real example here to point to that sometimes the conversation goes in the direction that if we cut emissions, we won't be able to grow the economy. But we do have other actors showing that that is not necessarily, of course, the case. Let's go to the next slide and we'll take a look at the sample sort of framework. And so this is sort of, again, when you're thinking through frameworks, there's key components. This would get adjusted, of course, to each municipality or, province or country, that would be wanting to implement its own carbon budget. But the essential elements are that you have the corporate carbon budget and a community carbon budget. You need to take into consideration how to quantify around your corporate operations, your capital projects, the policies and regulations that the municipality has, and external. So there be community-led initiatives too that can also make contributions, sort of to this. So widening the scope, of course, beyond the municipal entity and into the community. And so that involves the quantification of greenhouse gas emissions by project level. So not just taking a look at the inventory of what you're emitting and by where. We're going to get a bit more granular, and I'll talk about how to do that momentarily. Then the integration of greenhouse gas information into key decision-making processes. So this is the business of making visible the actual carbon implication, not just the dollar implication of the decisions essentially that we're going to make. We keep track of this and have form of accountability in annual greenhouse gas inventories. And again, then annual accountability through reporting. And municipalities are also starting to report to the community how successful or not that they are when they've adopted a carbon budget. Next slide, please. I like to think of this as a few ingredients that you need in order to be successful. So ingredient one would be alignment with financial systems. And we'll go into the next slide and I'll show a sample carbon budget workflow. Again, this would be largely adjusted or fine-tuned to your particular situation, but in general, we begin with project identification, budget, we move on to budget development, trying to balance the budget, of course, then in terms of execution and evaluation. So you want to be able to evaluate the greenhouse gas implications of your projects and how we're going to measure them and potentially reduce or not. It might be moved to sort of future years as well by keeping it in essentially this type of a stepped system. And we'll go to the next slide, please. And I just want to quickly sort of address two types of projects that can come. So number one is the carbon budget sort of approach and scenario, and number two would be a climate budget scenario. So there's two types of streams, of course, to consider how projects come forward. So under a climate action plan scenario, you're taking a look at all of the actions that the city needs to contemplate to reduce emissions. And as you implement them, of course, you get an emissions reduction. But that can miss some things, you know what I mean, as well. So, if you're only focused, of course, on reducing emissions related to the actions of the climate action plan, as opposed to the entire suite of actions that the municipality, of course, takes. So that's stream one, where you've got your capital forecasts and asset management. You're taking a look at what the city was going to do anyway. And then now we're looking at how do we reduce emissions, inside that stream, especially if they're not included, of course, in the climate action plan. Let's go to the next slide, please. You also, of course, will need, the next ingredient will be policies and tools. So as I mentioned before, and we can go to the next slide, once you get to deciding, of course, the projects that the municipality is going to do, you do need to start to quantify at that project level what the emissions, potential impact will be. SSG does have a tool that helps you do this, and it downloads right into Excel. So we have a GHG calculator extension, essentially, that can be downloaded. And for communities that we've worked with in terms of implementing their carbon budget, we offer a workshop to train everybody on how to essentially use the tool. We'll go to the next slide. We'll just take a bit of a deeper look. Because essentially what you're doing is you're identifying your project parameters, putting them into the greenhouse gas emissions calculator. And of course, if you have a climate lens, which is part of this, sort of conversation, it's helpful for council and reporting to council. You can start to show them what the greenhouse gas emissions impact is of their decisions. So if they go down one path, what the emissions impact would be, and you've made it visible to also potentially talk about mitigation strategies if we're going to go down a path where emissions are going to be increasing. But it also essentially daylights how many emissions we need to essentially reduce, and can go in the other direction. So it puts some clear decision-making parameters, in front of council, of course, as well at a more granular level than is sometimes seen. Let's go to the next slide. And the third ingredient is, of course, governance structure. And next slide. So we have a bit of a framework for governance. So in most situations, the decision to go down the carbon budget pathway might come from a decision from council for staff to figure out what this might look like and make a recommendation back. Beyond that, then you're sort of going from the bottom, sort of up, if you've been greenlit to go down this path. So you're taking a look again at your capital budget requests, your operating budget requests, your policy changes. And in terms of external reporting, you might also have an internal climate team that helps you work with this and helps different departments, sort of in this process as well. But this is how we start to integrate into your existing budget structure. And again, the specifics of your particular municipality, and certainly the municipalities we've worked with, are some variation of this with their own specific needs, sort of reflected in their governance structure. And so finance and administration essentially will work with the departments to refine these budget requests, sort of for submission. And then corporate budgeting oversees, of course, the budgeting process, and make sure that they're working with the chief administrative officer and your executive leadership team, of course, to also understand now the implications of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the projects. And once you've made your prioritization, of course, decisions for the budget each year, and understand where that potential budget gap is between the carbon budget and where the actual operating budget is, so you understand what your contribution to your future carbon liability will be, you can make that, of course, recommendation to the council. The last ingredient, we'll go to this, of course, is reporting. So how are we doing, in all of this? And let's go to the next slide. And so, of course, you want to report on the impact of this. And the city of Edmonton was the first city in Canada to adopt a carbon budget. And so they've worked it into all their key existing elements, of course, as we've talked about, aligning with their current systems. So it's in the capital budget, the approved operating budget, and then they have a specific report now that they do on the carbon budget itself, as well. And if we go to the next slide, what you'll see, of course, is that you may already be aware of this, is that they reported that they failed to meet their climate targets 2 years after launching the carbon budget. What's important about this is they've made visible, though, that they're in a serious attempt to figure this out. And from a climate action planning perspective, sort of where I sit, you wouldn't expect such a large operation, to and such a large change. And we also, of course, are still in a timeline where new technologies are being developed to reduce emissions. We're starting to answer questions about, once you've quantified greenhouse gas emissions in a part of municipal operations that you didn't think of that way before, you need some time to develop, hey, how do we reduce emissions in this area? What's available to us, and how quickly can we sort of start to bring that online? There'd be a bit of a lag, but if you have committed to doing this and committed to, of course, hitting the target for your community, this is the mechanism that's essentially going to help us, essentially get there. So from my perspective, it's a bravo to Edmonton for engaging in this process and of course, committing to reporting and showing that form of accountability that we will, with commitment, we will get there, in the end. So just to recap quickly, we can go to the next slide. The 4 ingredients are the alignment with financial systems, the enabling policies and tools, and on our end, we have the greenhouse gas emissions calculator, sort of add-on for Excel. Adjustments to the governance structure in terms of how carbon budget planning will happen, similar to the financial budget planning, and then the reporting mechanisms for accountability are in there as well. We'll go to the next slide. There is a bit of a sample corporate rollout, and we'll send this presentation to everybody who's attended the webinar today. So I won't go into the granular details that you see here, but just another example for consideration of how potentially you could roll something like this out. And last slide. And so thank you very much for your attention for this portion of the webinar. My colleague Aaliyah is going to introduce our speaker, Jill, and we're going to get really into a community example of where they're making this a reality. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Naomi. So I think we're throwing a lot of information at you. And if you do have questions, as Naomi said, please do throw them in the chat. We'll be monitoring them and maybe answering them right away or bringing them up later when we come to the Q&A. So it's really an honor to have Jill join us today and share her experience at Fredericton. Jillian Hudgins is the Environmental Strategist and Program Manager with the City of Fredericton. She coordinates the implementation of Fredericton's Climate Change Adaptation Plan, Community Energy and Emissions Plan, and Corporate Energy and Emissions Plan by working with staff across city departments and external partners to move the needle on climate action and resilience. Jill has a background in earth science, conservation, and ecosystem restoration, and previously worked with a range of local and international NGOs before joining the team at the City of Fredericton in 2021. So I'll hand it over to Jill.
Thank you, Aaliyah. I'm just going to share my screen here. Just confirm if you can see that.
You're great, Jill.
Okay. Yeah, once again, thanks for the invitation to speak at the webinar. Here at Fredericton, we're pretty early on in our climate budgeting experience. But we've been implementing this for just under a year. So I'm going to go through our experience here working with SSG to develop our carbon budget, a little bit of the steps that led into that, and then some lessons learned and things that we're looking to implement in the future, as well as some challenges that we experienced working through the carbon budget process. So Fredericton is the capital of New Brunswick. We're situated on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqey Nation, and it's governed by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. Fredericton is a pretty small city, but we are growing quickly. We're around 78,000 people right now. And we have a few decades of climate action experience. We brought forward our first climate plan back in 2001. And our most recent adaptation and mitigation plans around 2020, 2021. Our council actually increased our targets to a net zero target back in 2022 and declared a climate emergency in 2023. So our most recent inventory from 2023 saw our corporate greenhouse gas emissions down 29% from 2004 levels, and community emissions actually only down about 3%. And a lot of that was challenges related to population growth, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing. Here in New Brunswick, the provincial government realigned our borders when we incorporated 5,000 new residents all at once back in January 2023. With that came new service demands. We are also challenged by a lack of some financial tools like PACE legislation that are available in other provinces, and jurisdictional authority around bringing in stricter building codes compared to what the province can apply. So our step towards our climate budget started back in 2022 with a climate lens. This was added to our request for decision reports that go to council, as well as our business cases that accompany our capital budget proposals. It was just a qualitative lens, but it did consider both mitigation and adaptation. And it was designed to get staff and council thinking about the impacts of the projects and the initiatives that we were putting forward. So the person filling out the report had to think about, does this project take us closer to our targets? Does it have no impact, or does it take us away from our targets and there is a good reason related to public safety or human resource implications or another council priority? We did not apply that to planning reports. There was some concern around the perception that any net new development is also going to be accompanied by net new emissions. So we're still trying to reconcile what a climate lens on a planning report might look like. And this was accompanied by pretty robust staff and council training, along with a periodic check-in with council reporting back on how many reports were brought forward that took us towards or away from those priorities. So this was followed by, in the fall of 2022 for our 2023 budget cycle, a summary of funded capital projects. So at budget time, we put forward a summary of the cost of all of the projects that were positively contributing to both mitigation and adaptation for that budget cycle. We continued this for 24 and 25, but for those budget cycles, we split out our investments for different climate hazards. So how many projects were positively contributing to flood adaptation, to extreme heat adaptation, to heavy rainfall, as well as dividing them up between projects enabling GHG reductions, so building bike lanes, for example, or direct reduction projects, for example, buying electric vehicles in our fleet. And this information was delivered by our city treasurer as part of the budget deliberations. Naomi mentioned one of the key ingredients was that incorporation with climate and finance teams, and lucky here at the city that both climate and finance sit in the same department where our offices are very close by, and I had very early buy-in from the finance team, so that wasn't a challenge, although I recognize that can be challenged depending on the makeup of your city and how closely your finance and your climate teams are aligned. So that led to step 3, which happened last year. So we worked through late 2023 and early 2024 with SSG to develop a framework, a calculator. So Naomi showed the calculator, and that was adapted to New Brunswick emission intensities, and as well a fair share budget for both our corporate inventory and our community inventory. And along with that, over the last 2 years, we've developed other supportive tools and policies at the city. For example, we brought forward a green building guidelines and green fleet guidelines that guide new projects. So new builds or retrofits in our buildings have to abide by these particular guidelines that we've brought forward and were adopted by council. Green fleet guidelines is a bit of a flow chart for purchasing low carbon vehicles if the opportunity exists. And we also worked with an energy consultant to develop a list of projects that will help us meet or will get us to our 2030 goal in our municipally owned buildings. We had set aside sort of those suite of tools and policies that complemented our carbon budget and also really increased capacity particularly in our buildings and fleet team for thinking about projects in a different way. So projects that they would be putting forward for budget and ensuring that we are prioritizing low carbon options. So for our 2025 budget cycle, so this was presented through the fall of 2024, we implemented our first carbon budget. We kind of stopped short of framing it as a carbon budget and phrased it more as our climate budget and climate lens phase 2. We're a little apprehensive to jump head first into the carbon budget, but we did do a line by line analysis, so similar to previous years, evaluating projects for adaptation and the hazard addressed, as well as either a qualitative or where we could quantitative GHG impact, whether that be positive or negative. We looked at operational GHGs, for example, from the purchase of a vehicle. We looked at construction GHGs, and we did this because we were awarded a disaster mitigation and adaptation fund grant that required a climate lens assessment. And through that, we actually developed a tons per meter impact of our typical capital construction project here in the city. So for a ton of concrete laid or a certain meter of pipe laid, we know that a typical construction project where we're replacing linear infrastructure will result in this many tons of GHG. So we did incorporate that into our budget deliberations as well. And then we looked at life cycle GHG reduction where we could. So this was limited to fleet purchases and a couple of solar installations as well. Again, this information was provided by our city treasurer, along with a summary of investments, a dollar value in climate action and the quantifications of the GHGs were possible. And as I mentioned, we did stop short of communicating that overall carbon budget. And that's because we had just finalized the carbon budget in about June and started our 2025 budget deliberations, in August, September. We just didn't quite have the run up to socialize the idea among council and community about what is a carbon budget. This is our carbon budget. Here's where the role that the city plays in that carbon budget. So we're hoping this year to have more of that time to, again, communicate that idea and educate our council and the community so that we can present it for our 2026 budget. So this was the result of our 2025 budget cycle. We identified 14 projects that would directly reduce greenhouse gases. Of those, we had 5 that were quantifiable for a total of 160 tons reduced annually. A lot of those had operational life cycle GHG reductions as well. We identified a further 15 projects that would enable future GHG reduction through building active transportation, infrastructure, transit, service changes, things like that. We identified 13 projects that would directly increase greenhouse gases. Most of these were net new fleet purchases, and of those, 4 had a quantifiable impact of positive 13 tons of CO2 equivalent. And as I mentioned, we also identified construction-related greenhouse gases from capital projects where we could, for a total of 1,350 tons of CO2 equivalent. And finally, we identified 30 projects that would positively contribute to our climate resilience in Fredericton. So moving on, or closing, I guess, with some of the challenges and the lessons learned. As I mentioned, we kind of caught this project, or finalized this project about 3/4 of the way through the year. So catching those projects that were going to be proposed for a 2025 budget cycle early enough was a bit challenging and wasn't really an option. So that was an opportunity for next year to catch those projects very early on and talk to project managers about alternatives, or have they thought about other ways of bringing this project forward. The project maturity, so some of the projects being proposed were, maybe in a design and then build phase in the same year. So there wasn't necessarily a lot of detail, or they included budget line items that just said things like active transportation projects, and then those projects would have been prioritized at a later time. So without those details, it would have been difficult, or it was difficult to quantify greenhouse gases. We were still able to give them a qualitative ranking. And then on the operational side, we didn't tackle our operational budget. That we're leaving that for a future step. And then during budget deliberations, some challenges around communicating the meaning of the carbon budget to council and the public as well. Communicating the city's role in our community budget. So Naomi mentioned this, the community releases, a certain amount of emissions, but the city only has control over a certain portion of that. That communication, of we can only influence a certain portion of this carbon budget that we've set ourselves, is a tricky communication angle that we continue to explore with our council, community, and the media. And then understanding the value to councillors as well, among many other competing priorities and shifting political focus, especially now. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Aaliyah. Oh, you're on mute, Aaliyah.
Goodness. Thank you so much, Jill, for that awesome presentation. So now we're going to go into the Q&A period, and my colleague Naomi is going to be moderating that. And so we hope you're ready with quite a few questions, and I'll hand it over to Naomi.
Great. Thanks very much, Leanne. Thanks very much, Jill, for that. It's always exciting to see, to me, what it looks like, too, when we move into implementation, phase of things. So thank you very much for sharing all your insights and learning about what it was like. All right, so we've got a question for Jill. Thanks from Alex here. Do any of the projects need behavior change from citizens? So for example, changing parking space for bike racks, removing parking spaces for bike lanes, promoting ride sharing.
So is Alex asking, did any of the projects proposed for 2025 or just in particular? Because a lot of the projects in our climate action plan, and our, other supporting plans, active transportation connection plan, for example, do require behavior change. You can build all the bike lanes you want, but if people don't, if there's no uptake, then there's not going to be any change. So, with regards to 2025 projects, there wasn't anything in particular that it, for example, removed parking for bike racks or removed parking for bike lanes, but maybe if Alex wants to elaborate.
Hi,
Oh,
Alex.
Hi, Julian. I'm right here. Thank you.
Okay.
The question is more regarding how citizens reacted to some of these examples and whether the social acceptance of the carbon budget and of the projects suggested in the carbon budget were accepted by the citizens or not. So that was more of the questioning.
Yeah, so for our carbon budget this year, as I mentioned, we kind of framed it more as a climate budget, and we stopped short of that full communication around this is our budget and this is our carbon deficit this year, and we did or did not meet it this year. There were slides during our budget deliberation about the carbon budget and the climate budget, but the projects that we were able to quantify were mainly entirely corporate capital purchases. So buses, fleet vehicles, ice resurfaces. We had 2 solar arrays, and some equipment purchases. So none of those were particularly contentious with the community.
I can speak to a little bit about well, Fredericton has engaged in like on understanding too how do we move behavior wise, you know what I mean, to do climate action plan, implementation, sort of as well. They did a really interesting project with us, to be sort of on that. So they've had that foresight, as well to be thinking about it that way too. In terms of, I don't think you asked this, but sometimes we wonder, so much of climate action is actually a behavior change exercise once we've decided and understand what the target is, and that will require changes, to the way that we live, work, and play, essentially, but ultimately I think for the better, and to see it and learn to communicate it in ways that actually talk about increasing community well-being, you know what I mean, as well. And I think there's been some communications in general that I've seen, so this isn't about Fredericton or anyone in particular, but that sort of stress the limitation, sort of impact on it, as opposed to the door opening, I think, aspect of a lot of it. Some of it is, of course, going to be different, you know what I mean, sort of, and hard, and there's one way forward. But I can give an example in Victoria. To be clear, I didn't work with the City of Victoria on this, but this is where I live, and adding bike lanes in, has started to happen across the city. It's under what's called a AAA framework, like all ages and accessibility, is how they went. And infrastructure projects do invite a bit of ire, let's just say, do you know what I mean, sort of from the public, even in a community where Victoria's had the largest mode share outside of a car, do you know what I mean, shift in the country. So meaning biking and walking are quite popular, you know what I mean, sort of here. And so even in that case, it was a bit of a disruption because we're changing the way people get around. And so there'll always, I think, be a period too of some bumps while we learn to adjust our behavior, sort of that's what's going on. And we don't think our ways into new behaviors. We have to do the new behavior. And that's a bit of the paradox around how you get there, I think, with as least bumps, you know what I mean, sort of as possible. So it's great to see that you're thinking, you know what I mean, along these lines, Alex, because it's very much a part of any type of, energy and climate transition, that we have in front of us or that we're already engaged in. Did we answer your question?
It was a very good answer, very complete. Thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate that. All right, let's see if we've got some more questions in the chat, or if you feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. Got another one here for Jill. Can you share more about the staff council training mentioned during your step 1 climate lens phase, and any other insights with respect to building acceptance internally for the carbon accounting framework?
Yeah, certainly. So the staff council training, so we had an internal working group that helped develop the climate lens a few years ago. I look to other municipalities for inspiration. There's a few examples available. I'm happy to share mine. If you want to send me an email afterwards, I can certainly share. Or even if you go on our eScribe where all of our admin reports are, you can see on every admin report there's a climate lens component with every single report, and all of those are public. But after development of the climate lens, I wrote an accompanying guide with lots of different examples of real life projects that a project manager in a municipality might be proposing. Things from policy level, a capital project, and operational change, and I kind of walked people through, this would be taking us towards our targets, and here's why. This would be taking us away from our targets because it uses more fossil fuels. Here are some other priorities that could be trade-offs that you might want to look at based on our municipal plan and current council priorities. So if it's taking us away from those targets, please write out, for the particular reason why. So the training involved a webinar for all management level staff, anybody who would be writing an admin report. That was followed up by one-on-one training for those who, write a lot of reports or have a particularly strange projects that they might be proposing, things that might be a bit out of the ordinary. I'm also available all the time. If somebody is writing a report throughout the year, they can call me, they can email me, they can send me what they have, and I'm happy to review it and offer advice. And it was also, we did a lunch and learn with council to walk them through how to interpret the climate lens as well, similar to those, giving examples of here's what you might see coming forward. Here's why it might be labeled as such. A like for like replacement is going to be no change in our emissions, right? So yeah, again, happy to have a chat with anybody that's exploring a climate lens. Certainly, as I mentioned, I took inspiration from others, so I'm happy to share. No need to reinvent the wheel.
That's so generous. And so thank you, Jill. That's wonderful. Dylan, you wanted to ask a question on camera. You're up.
Hey, yeah, sorry my camera's not working right now for some reason. Kind of a follow-up to Alex's question, just in terms of the types of initiatives that you do build into these kind of climate action plans and in terms of what can be quantified and what can't. And I know, Jillian, you said that the major focus areas were more kind of capital management projects that are more easily quantifiable with kind of direct shifts in technology or procurement that you can quantify. But in terms of the more integrated behavioral change kind of practices for the municipality, I guess my question is, how do you integrate those things in that will have a material impact and are kind of the foundational shifts needed to support those additional capital, kind of more quantifiable capital expenditures? How do you build those into the plan? How do you quantify them? Because I think that's a lot of area where the communication is the most difficult, as you're mentioning, Naomi, with like getting the community on board with the infrastructure changes required, having the city understand what those things mean and how to communicate those things. I'm just curious how you start to build in more intangibles to quantifiable metrics that you can include in the plan.
Jill, are you okay to start that one? And I've got some follow-up that might be helpful to Dylan when you're done.
Sure. Well, I was going to reference the calculator that you built, and there's some good examples of policy type changes or operational changes. They do require some assumptions. For example, a change in transit operation, right? You would have to assume an increase in ridership and then work that into the calculator. So there's going to be a margin of error there. So that would be one way, but I believe SSG has a lot more climate planning experience than I do, so I'll hand it over to the folks there.
Don't shortchange the amount of experience you have now, Jill. We're working on this, and again, us working on the project, too, around engagement and how we take a look at shifting behaviors both in the municipality and the community, itself. Fredericton's really leading the way, in my opinion, on thinking how to practically do this and be very successful at it. So I'm going to introduce my colleague Aisha, who she's been answering some questions to and adding some detail in the chat. And so I'm going to bring her into this answer, but a lot of it does come down to just what Jill said. She said it very well. You know, we can create these tools, and I mean, back in the early days of SSG, back in the early 2000s, the question was, how do you even quantify greenhouse gas emissions, right? And, you know, like, and general. And so we started to create a tool for that. And then we eventually partnered with What If Technologies and took that Excel spreadsheet that was pretty fancy and advanced for its time, you know, and integrated into a more holistic model, you know what I mean, too, where we make these assumptions, but now we can show you what the economic impact is, the jobs impact, you know what I mean, sort of is. It's more fidelity to start to tell us, here's actually where you should plan your bus routes for greater success. And that's in the climate action planning, you know, sort of program. And that's the Senna model, you know, that we have. And so the GHG calculator tool here for project quantification does have some fidelity in it that Aisha can speak to, you know what I mean, sort of in a moment. But there will always be, no matter what, right now, a bit of a gap, you know what I mean, in some assumptions. But getting folks into the target zone, like getting a council and senior staff to decide we're going to go down a carbon budget route, is such a success, do you know what I mean, in and of itself, because it's what kickstarts the entire municipality to get involved in climate, not just say the climate team, you know, for example, or the sustainability, you know what I mean, sort of coordinator, depending on what sort of staff, you know, complement or, you know, that your municipality has. This is the tool that starts to get people thinking about it really in a way that hasn't, you know, sort of been done before. There are different adjustments we can make, you know, sort of to the calculator, but when we do the training, we sort of go through this and sort of explain, because even when we model, we're having to literally put assumptions in, and we do that on the best available data at the time. But the frequency that comes with the accountability mechanism helps us get refined, you know, as we actually see, we assumed a transit rider increase. If we did X, did we get it? You know what I mean, too? And if not, we need to sort of adjust, you know, from there. So this really becomes a very annual, you know what I mean, sort of focused exercise. But over to Aisha, what would you add to this, Aisha?
It's kind of difficult to see where to start. Like if you're talking about corporate behavior change, one is a capital budget. We can do all the quantification there, but we're actually working on developing another set of tools and framework on how to move the needle for operating budget. And in that sense, we will still be using this sort of calculator. Like if you are going to have a program, then you expect to have 3 people there and they're going to be traveling, then how much fuel are they going to use? If you're going to introduce a program for, let's see, assisted housing or something, then just in terms of when you're planning a program, this is the kind of fuel you'll be using, this is how much electricity you'll be using, that you can quantify all those things. And we hope to have that developed at some point in the future. And then another thing is behavior for the community. That's also something we are trying to figure out with certain municipalities that we're working with who are interested in doing this. Again, as a municipality, you do not have the authority to say, no, you cannot drive a car anymore. No, you cannot use gas anymore. You know, you may be able to introduce some legislation, but you don't have blanket authority to say those things, but you can incentivize, and you can also try to get people to come along. So we're trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the ways we were thinking of doing this is maybe a survey, a voluntary survey, where people can come in, tell us what are their initiatives, and then have that as a showcase for the municipality to share back. And we find peer pressure works very well in most communities. But again,
or social proof, as we like to say, when you see other people doing it, you know, we're actually more likely to adopt, you know what I mean, those types of behaviors. I didn't mean to cut you off though, Aisha, please carry on. And I've got one more thing for you, Dylan, and we'll come back to you.
Sorry. Dylan wants to come into the chat list.
Okay. One other thing I would say too, in terms of what you brought up, you know, Dylan, as well, is like there's a bit of an underlying, I think, in your question and many people's questions about, but how do we get the people to like it? You know what I mean, in some way, shape, or form, because we also certainly see climate conversations, you know, climate action conversations. We also hear from people who don't, you know what I mean, in fact, like it. And of course, that can influence elected officials, you know what I mean, and other other folks. And so I think just like Edmonton being brave and also, you know, sort of coming out and saying we didn't hit, you know what I mean, like our carbon budget targets, but they're not stopping, you know what I mean? It's like a commitment to iteration and going and ongoing. So you need to give yourself a bit of compassion. It'll take time to figure out how to work with folks and find the right ways to incentivize. You know what I mean, sort of this shift, and some people will not come along. I think we have to accept that, but a lot of people often, do you know what I mean, sort of will. So there's a certain amount of persistence, I think, that we also need to adopt, you know what I mean, a framework in our minds, you know what I mean, too, for that, you know, we're going to learn a lot by engaging and trying to shift things. But back to you, Dylan, and then we've got a question from Christian.
Yeah, we're low on time here, so I'll let the two that said they have questions in the chat because I got a lot more questions on this, so I'll leave it for now. But thank you all for the answers.
Okay, thank you. We're glad you came today. Christian, you had a question. Did you want to ask it on camera or audio?
Yeah, one, if it will let me. Perfect. So,
Hi.
hi there. Hopefully a fairly straightforward question to like a.
Oh, you're on pot. You've frozen. Is just for me or for everyone else? For you, Jill? Do you see Christian frozen? Okay.
I can't see or hear Christian anymore. Oh, he's back.
Okay, you're back.
Is that okay? Okay. So really quick, how do you support divisions or departments in identifying those specific initiatives that are going to contribute to sort of achieving whatever your carbon targets might be, which is like that generative question. And then once you have those ideas, let's say, how do you work with them to prioritize them over, let's say, so there's like a generation problem, and then there's also sort of a fiscal question as to how do you balance this out against all the other sort of service level priorities that might be needing to be addressed.
Yeah, maybe I'll touch on the prioritization first. That is definitely the tricky part. You know, we're always going to have to balance our financial budget, no matter what. You know, that is still going to take priority at the municipality. The prioritization is going to, you know, the team that prioritizes those projects is going to be different in different municipalities. You know, here it goes to senior leadership, CAO level. Other municipalities, you know, chief financial officer would have that final approval. So influencing the prioritization is definitely tricky because there's a lot of other priorities right now. You know, public safety, affordability, housing, we're all facing those as emerging or, you know, fairly new issues that are jumping above climate, it seems. In terms of working with project managers, you know, I've been really lucky here. We are a small municipality. That means a small team. Often people wear different hats. So for example, here in Fredericton, the manager of fleet and the manager of building services is the same person. And he's one of my closest allies. And he really, you know, brought forward this idea to develop green building guidelines and green fleet guidelines to really help that prioritization, so that when another user group who uses fleet comes forward to him and says, I want to buy a new vehicle, okay, we're going to walk through this flow chart to see, does it meet you know, our low carbon threshold? Is there an option out there? Does it meet the service level? Or do we have to defer that purchase for a couple of years until there's another low carbon option out there? So finding those champions in your organization, working with them, you know, doing some one-on-one guidance with people. We did really kind of start with baby steps with the climate lens, training people. You know, there was some hand-holding through the process when it was new, phone calls and emails and sitting down with folks to say, okay, this is the result of the project you're putting forward. This is what would have resulted in it meeting our targets or getting us towards our targets. So it does take time, it does take work, relationship building across the organization and finding champions.
It does. And so it's a big process, do you know what I mean, sort of in and of itself. And you're sort of entering an existing system. There is the way each municipality prioritizes, and we go over this when we do our carbon budget training when we're working with a municipality. We already learn how their current decision-making process and system works with respect to coming up with the budget, and so now we're layering on extra information, and so that gives them more information for their prioritization, of course, conversation. And since in this case, I'm assuming there'll be like commitment from like the council, the mayor and council, do you know what I mean, to go through the carbon budgeting process. So they'll be expecting, a quantification of some kind and an understanding of what these decisions now mean with this added layer, sort of information, and needing to get to the target that they have, essentially committed to. And as Jill said, there'll always be trade-offs, you know what I mean, too, in terms of balancing the financial budget, of course, and working towards getting at the carbon budget. But that will take a few years as they shift, you know what I mean, too. And internally, yeah, having people or a team to actually go to each department and do the training and say, okay, so this is now what carbon budgeting means for your department. We have to learn how to quantify these projects. We know we won't be able to perfectly quantify all of them, but we will be we'll be making that attempt, right, to make it visible as it sort of goes up the chain, you know what I mean, sort of, if you will. And so that just in and of itself starts to modify, you know what I mean, the process, the decision-making process, in and of itself. So, making an important contribution to helping get towards your target. We're right at 11 o'clock on the West Coast here. These have been excellent questions. Jill has put her email in the chat as well. And Kaylee, I think I can stick around. You know what I mean, too. Jill, do you have a moment to stick around? We can also release everybody else if they'd like to go. But on behalf of SSG, I would just like to thank everybody for your time and attention and excellent questions today, and hope you have a great rest of your day. And we look forward to hearing from you if we can help in any way.
Just a reminder
and-
before everybody leaves, our next.
Sorry, Emmy.
Yeah.
We have an upcoming one.
Yeah, our next one in our Municipal Climate Action Toolkit series is going to be on April 24th. So we hope to see everyone there as well.
Come and learn more about how to quantify those projects and the difficult cases. So Dylan, hopefully that will be useful for you, and others as well. All right. Kaylee, do you want to ask your question?
It's a quick question, so maybe I will slip it in, Jill, if you're still
Yeah,
available.
I'm still here. Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned that growth is a key challenge for you to meeting your emission reduction targets. Do you or have you considered tracking and reporting carbon intensity indicators as well, such as emissions per citizen, to make sure that the progress you're making isn't kind of lost mathematically behind that population growth?
Yes. Yeah, and we do, because those are a lot more positive. We have been seeing reductions. I think we were at 27% reduction per capita in 2023. So we have seen some progress there. It's just the council has committed to an overall target, 50% by 2030. So we report on that target. Our previous target had been a per capita target, and then they did switch it, but we do report on that, both for our corporate inventory, because we're adding on new services all the time to meet the needs of those new citizens, but community-wide as well.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Oops. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, good one. I was doing so well. Thanks, everybody. That was a great question as well, Kaylee. And thanks for asking it. Thanks everyone for coming. We don't have another announcement, do we, Emmy, just before we go? Just the next webinar?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, everyone. Really great to have your participation today. And yeah, like I said, good luck. And if we can be of help, don't hesitate to reach out. Take care.